Now let's talk about the Calvin cycle. So let's have an overview again. We said the light reaction happens in the thylakoid membranes, and what it produces, well, the byproduct is oxygen, but it produces ATP and NADPH. And where do these go? They go into the Calvin cycle. These molecules are going to provide the energy so the cell can capture CO2 into the Calvin cycle and then turn it into G3P, which is going to go and become glucose. Now, the Calvin cycle reactions happen in the stroma. So the Calvin cycle has 3 different steps: carbon fixation, reduction, and then regeneration. The cycle starts with a molecule of 3-ribulose bisphosphate, which is a 5-carbon molecule, and then when the CO2 comes in, that carbon is added to this 5-carbon to give you a 6-carbon molecule. The enzyme that carries this step, it's a very important enzyme. It's called Rubisco. Then this molecule, now this 6-carbon molecule splits, and then it undergoes a series of changes with getting phosphates from ATP, and then also getting additional electrons from NADPH, and then it turns into G3P. Or in a previous video I showed you, it was called G3AP. They're those the same. So this G3P then is going to leave the Calvin cycle to go and become glucose. Then some of these G3P, there are many G3P molecules that is made. Some of it goes back into the cycle and it gets regenerated to regenerate 3-ribulose bisphosphate. So then you fix the carbon, you reduce it by adding electrons, and then you're going to regenerate this original molecule. Now, you are not responsible for knowing the numbers, how many ATP or NADPH are involved. You're not responsible for these intermediate steps. Just learn that the Calvin cycle has 3 steps: carbon fixation, reduction, and regeneration. Know that you start with 3-RUBP, CO2 is added, and the responsible enzyme is Rubisco, and then the product of Calvin cycle is G3P. That's all you need to know. You don't need to remember these numbers. So this is a summary of photosynthesis. We have the light reaction in the thylakoid membrane. These are the thylakoid membranes. Water is a reactant. You get oxygen as a byproduct. But then what comes out of light reaction that is going to be used by Calvin cycle are ATP and NADPH. And then these molecules are used as a source of electrons and energy to fix the CO2 to make G3P, which will then go and become glucose. And then what comes out of it is ADP and NADP plus, which is going to be fed into light reaction again. So I've prepared this version of this graphic for you so you can test your knowledge. Now you want to use radioactively labeled oxygen to trace carbon fixation in a plant. So now we're talking about the dark reaction, the light independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle, right? Carbon fixation happens during the Calvin cycle. So we're not talking about the light reaction. So you want to use radioactively labeled oxygen to trace carbon fixation. You should incorporate the radioactivity labeled oxygen into, which one of these is correct? Well, is it oxygen? Well, no, oxygen is a product of the light reaction. CO2, yeah, CO2 is fixed into that process. So that seems like a good place to put this radioactive oxygen and trace what happens to the carbon. Water? No, actually water plays a role in the light reaction. Glucose? No, actually glucose is a product that comes way after the Calvin cycle, because remember we get G3P and then it turns into glucose. But we want to trace carbon fixation, and the best answer, the correct answer is B, because that's the only molecule that is going to go into the Calvin cycle, which is going to be processed so that we can follow the reaction. Now, what is the carbon cycle? Carbon cycle describes how carbon molecules are recycled in the atmosphere. So let's follow one. So we got atmospheric CO2 that is captured by photosynthesis. And here we have organic matter that the rest of the organisms can consume. And then we also, so that turns into organic matter in other organisms, and these organisms eventually die. So this carbon ends up going back into the soil. And some of it becomes fossil fuels, which we use. Now, some of these organisms that take the carbon from trees before they die, they actually digest that organic matter that we eat, even the animals and us, and then they release the CO2 back into the atmosphere through respiration. So when we break down glucose, if you remember from cellular respiration, it goes back into the atmosphere. And then that CO2 again goes back into the system through photosynthesis. The ocean also does photosynthesis and respiration, and it constantly recycles this carbon. So in the absence of burning fossil fuels or deforestation, the system is in balance. The atmospheric CO2 is captured, plants capture it, the rest of us consume it. We spit some of it back into the atmosphere when the living organisms, including the trees, die. Some of that carbon goes into the soil and it's stored as storages of carbon. So this constantly cycles. The system is in balance. All right. Now comes the Industrial Revolution, when we start digging these fossil fuels out. We're going to burn it. We add more CO2 into the plant. We do deforestation. We put more CO2 into the atmosphere. And then we breed a lot of cows, and they are responsible for putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, and the system becomes unbalanced. And what is the consequence of having too much CO2 in the atmosphere? It's global warming. So that's one of the ways that deforestation, burning of fossil fuels, is leading to warming of our atmosphere, and basically takes a system that until the Industrial Revolution in balance and creates a large imbalance.